This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Good morning, Matt. Good morning, Connell. I'm a bit excited about this episode. This is part 2 of our Thrive Perspectives episode, and we're talking about NDEs, or near-death experiences. Good morning, gentlemen. Cool one this morning, but we are going to be warmed up pretty soon, I'm sure. Allow me just to give a bit of an intro of where we came from for those who maybe haven't heard the previous episode, and I really encourage you to go back and listen to that. But just to remind us all what an NDE is, an NDE is an event that takes place as a person is dying or indeed is already clinically dead, basically. It's a near-death experience. Obviously, it's called a near-death experience because to have an NDE, you actually have to come back again. Now, one of the things that we know from research now of many thousands of cases by academic experts, but let me just say there are millions of people who have reported NDEs around the world now, is that there are very typical experiences for these people across the board. And the things that are consistent are that it involves an out-of-body journey. In other words, seeing your body from above, traveling through a tunnel to a place of indescribable beauty, usually, encountering spiritual beings, potentially deceased loved ones, and most profoundly communicating with an ineffable, supreme being of light and unconditional love, and then ultimately a return to the body. Though that's probably the most consistent thing across the bulk of NDEs.
Would you add to, I think one of the common ones is the life review aspect of that as well. Definitely there's a sense of accountability for our lives that is a very common part of that. Yeah,
true. Although lesser so, interestingly enough. Those things are sort of over the 60% and the life reviews are around the 50% of people who experience that. Yeah. Now, NDEs are not always positive, and we'll talk a bit about that in this episode as well, but they are epiphanic. In other words, it's transformational for people who come back one way or the other. It changes their lives. And I think the point of our conversation today is we want to have a look at the evidence of these NDEs, or what's been reported, and juxtapose those, I guess, against Christian theology, and look at where there's congruence and where there's incongruence, and how we might understand that. I think important to say as well, for those that perhaps are a little bit skeptical about NDEs, obviously it's very difficult to prove anything when the only person who's the witness is the person who went and came back and is providing their experience. Let me just say to that, when you've got many thousands of people reporting the same thing who have never talked to each other, that although it's not definitive, it's clearly starting to point to a weight of evidence that would suggest that these experiences are true. But more importantly, and I think where research and science has really picked up on this, is people who are able to report things during their NDE that they could not possibly have known. In other words, seeing things on the roof of buildings during their out-of-body experience, or I think, as you mentioned in the last podcast, in other rooms, completely different places, and then people looking, wow, how on earth did they know that?
Or meeting deceased people that they didn't know were deceased yet, and things like that.
So there's quite verifiable things that we can look at and go, there's actually, because one of the arguments you can make is it's people making this stuff up, but they're actually coming back with information that it would not have been possible for them
to know, correct,
to know unless they'd had the experience. And so there's a lot of verifiable, I suppose, data that you can gather, correct. And that's exactly what researchers have been doing, because they've encountered it to some point themselves, which has sort of compelled them to look into it more. And then they've gone through, I think there's a website that kind of categorizes collects all the NDE experiences. And so I think, but what they've done is they've then gone through and taken all of that and then worked through thousands of them and produced actual proper research backed analysis using this data to substantiate that these NDEs are almost close as we can get to being proven that there is something going on.
That's real.
That's not just a materialistic response. Like, you can't just say it's the response of a dying brain or some sort of dream or hallucination.
And I think those things have been ruled out. Just to give a little bit of perspective to this as well, in the 1980s, the Gallup poll organization, estimated that in the United States alone, 8 million people have had an NDE. So we're not talking about a handful of people here or there. And now, obviously, evidence hasn't been able to be collected from all of those people. Yeah. But I guess what we're saying is there's a significant amount of research over large numbers, not just 150 people, but thousands of people. That's providing the evidence where this conversation can go. So
it's the cumulative case really that matters here. I think we've got to be very careful of focusing on any one case because, people come back from these and they've had a kind of epiphany, and so they come back with a degree of confidence, obviously, because they have a kind of knowledge that perhaps is a higher form of knowledge than they've had before. But that doesn't mean that they know everything. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And also there's, this is a point we made in the last episode, there's a very strong interpretive aspect. They're having to interpret these experiences. They also place, that part of their interpretive grid that they impose on the experience and come back and that frames their explanation is pre-existing beliefs and so forth, somewhat as well.
Although less so. Again, reading the research, the things that I mentioned before, very common regarding whether Eastern or Western.
Yeah.
And they found there was a much more commonality regardless of your context.
That's the interesting thing. Yeah. That's where the cumulative case, because a lot of the really common things are remarkably biblical.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They're remarkably biblical. But my point is that we've just got to be careful focusing on any one experience and treating that person as a prophet. Like, because, someone will say things, actually all religions are, are right and this, or they'll make pronouncements that part of their interpretive grid. And, we've got to put all of this together because, there are some people that said, it's all just love and no one's condemned, and it's all fine. And yet you've got all of these many, many other cases where people actually do experience essentially hell. Mm-hmm. And so, we just got to be careful not to grab onto any one. And look, in any case, the point is that we're not drawing from these experiences to create our fundamental beliefs.
No, that's right.
I think that's really important. However, the cumulative case does point to, I think they really point to the veracity of the biblical account. It's actually remarkable how consistent they are. Now, one of the things that we've pointed out is, for example, a being of light and the idea of unconditional love. I mean, these are uniquely biblical ideas. The idea of God is love is a remarkably biblical idea. So let's maybe and Connell, you had some thoughts on what are the big takeaways. So, what can we say in terms of sort of a bit of an at least?
So for me, the most significant fundamental, I think the starting point here is that atheism is in trouble. That's the bottom line here. I think all of the evidence says that these things are real. That means that the brain and our material body is not all there is, that this consciousness and some ability is actually some sort of life for sure beyond the material body that we exist in. So
atheism and materialism, which is the view that only physical reality exists and that our minds are purely the product of our brains, that's completely demolished.
So anybody who thinks that
these,
when I die, I cease to exist, that is as a view is really being challenged by these NDEs, because, to
say the least.
Yeah, that's the least. If you're going to take anything, at least take some assurance of that there's something in that gives us a real confidence that we're actually seeing this being backed up, I'd say scientifically and inverted, but it's certainly from research and data, academic research that's indisputable, that there is some sort of experience beyond the material body. And an example of that is we mentioned the author Bruce Grayson, who was one of the sort of key researchers, not a Christian, was an atheist, and switched on to this idea of NDEs from one of his patients because he's a I think he's a neuroscientist or a neurosurgeon or maybe a psychiatrist, one of those ones. And so they got him into doing the research. And, you know, one of the big things that he says is that he's figured out from being a psychiatrist and from looking at the NDEs is that you can almost conclusively say that the mind and consciousness is not in the brain. And so mind is essentially in this other kind of spiritual or other reality, and it exists apart from the body, and it goes on to live even when the body dies. And the role of the brain is to...
This is according to Grayson.
Yeah, this is what he thinks is going on.
Which was actually consistent also because we did a past episode on McGilchrist, who is, you know, focuses on neurology and the role of the brain. So it's remarkably consistent with that as well.
So he describes the brain as being like a filter. So the real us is our mind that exists in this other realm of, we'll call it the spiritual
dimension,
other dimension.
Yeah.
And then the brain basically puts a filter around it that localizes us inside our body. So it's why we exist in this body and not some other body, and it localizes us into space-time, and it removes all the distractions of that other dimension that we're not really living in. We're only living in space and time. So it localizes us into that. And if the brain becomes damaged, it can shut down our ability to reason and understand reality. And he actually talks about his experience with dementia patients. You know, as the brain kind of, you know, breaks down, you become more limited in your understanding and aware of what's going on around you. He says one of the really interesting things, though, is that a few days out from someone who has dementia and is approaching death is their brain actually starts to die. And in that process, all of a sudden, all the effects of dementia start to reverse. They start to become aware of reality. They recognize people they haven't recognized for years. It's like all of a sudden they start to become alive again, and then they die.
And this is because the brain is actually dying.
This is what he thinks. It helps explain the fact that the brain is actually starting to let go.
Yeah.
And now the mind is becoming, it's not so filtered.
Yeah.
It's expanding. Our mind is the thing that's really us.
And so McGilchrist, you know, refers to the brain as a limiter because it focuses consciousness. And this is interesting. There's an interesting connection here. And I'm going to throw this in for a moment. We won't get too lost in this subject. Yeah. But Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, there's also a documentary series being created, which is exploring a sort of revival of the therapeutic use of psychedelic drugs. Yeah. You know, which is something that's sort of coming back and you know, something that we'd probably hear a little bit more about, you know, in the future. But one of the things that he explains in that book, because what happens is that there are certain psychedelic drugs that sort of overcome the brain's limiting function and basically open up the awareness so they disable this limiting function. So people then experience this kind of open, porous, that they become open and porous to all of reality, and they have very similar experiences to those people, to people who are having near-death experiences. You know, being of light, the interconnectedness of everything, the sort of, I mean, it's quite remarkable, the similarity.
Well, the researchers in the psychedelics say that what seems to be happening there is that we're getting the brain out the way, which is why it's being used in therapies for treating people with depression, for example, is that it's able to get the brain out of the way so you can actually deal with some of the underlying issues that's causing various mental health conditions to manifest. So when you kind of start to switch off the brain, which is essentially... Remember, what are psychedelics doing? Are they ramping up the activity in the brain and making us become hyper-aware, or are they slowing down? I think it's slowing the brain down and moving it out the way. So now all of a sudden, your mind and consciousness becomes like super-aware in a way that you never had before.
Yeah.
So that seems to make a lot of sense when you compare it to all of these different...
By the way, can I just say, not that we're, you know, advocating people to go off and use psychedelic drugs to have spiritual experiences, because there are problems with that also. And, you know, I mean, one of the uses of psychedelic drugs is in palliative care. They're using it to overcome sort of death anxiety in some clinics. And this is mainly in America. I'm not sure if this has been introduced in Australia yet. I mean, the problem with that is that, they have these big spiritual experiences and they experience a God of unconditional love. Because, of course, in this world, in this realm right now, of course, that is, God is present and all people are experiencing God all the time. It's all about how we respond to that, right? So the problem is that it might give a false sense of security because, yes, we are, we are loved, but again, life is all about how we respond to that, know.
Can I just say too, just the further caution, because I have thought about what's the difference. Like, is there something good about taking a psychedelic drug and essentially being able to see God and see the spiritual realm? And wrestling with that, the big difference, I think,
potentially
is NDEs and psychedelics can take you to a similar place. But we're warned in Scripture not to seek spirits, interaction with spirits, to seances, consult with mediums. We're specifically warned not to seek and desire those things. Where NDEs, we're not seeking. It's actually something, it's obviously God allows us to experience. So the difference here is with psychedelics, I'm taking my curiosity or whatever to take psychedelics, and I'm going to enter into this experience, not with God, but with my own intuitions and so on. And I am not equipped to deal with the spirits and the deceptions that could potentially be thrown at me in that space. I don't know what I'm doing in there. It's unfamiliar to me. So, and I think that's why God's warning us, don't go there. Like, if you're going to go there, He will take us. We have to pass through these places and enter into that. And I think this is what NDEs are. But God takes us in an NDE, and He's with us in that.
There's also an inherent issue with removing the filter that God created.
Yeah.
So part of the purpose in this life is to shape that filter and in the right sort of way. But just kind of removing that forcefully.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some theological problems with that. So again, we're not sort of advocating this, but
for the same reason, it does
point to something.
He doesn't want us to seek mediums. He's not saying it's not true.
Yeah,
He's not saying you won't encounter spirits. If you want to go looking for them and you invite them in, you will encounter them. And He's saying don't.
Yeah.
So to me, that's all in the same basket, but NDEs are fundamentally different.
Yeah. So allow me just to quote a short excerpt from another story, just to support, the claim around the brain not being everything. Neurosurgeon Eben Alexander, not a Christian, he had his own NDE after a 7-day coma. He recalled
he's a neurologist, neurosurgeon. Yeah.
He recalled riding on the wings of a butterfly, as he described it, over the countryside with a woman that he described as his guardian angel, who spoke to him telepathically, assuring him that he was loved, but that he had to go back. After his recovery, Alexander, who had been adopted as a young child, reconnected with his birth family and received a picture of his sister whom he had never met or seen and who had died years earlier. Stunned, Alexander, the neurosurgeon, recognized her as the guardian angel from his NDE. Moreover, trained as a brain surgeon at Harvard Medical School, so fairly well qualified, and other top facilities, Alexander was further able to examine his own charts and conclude that there was no plausible way known to science that his brain could have functioned to produce these images during his coma.
Yeah.
So the brain clearly isn't our essence, which we would know as Christians, but again, science is discovering this.
It's interesting. I mean, his account, and again, he's a very intelligent guy that comes back and he's putting an interpretive,
of course,
grid over, and I think in some ways with just a little bit of overconfidence. I probably was a little critical of that. However, there's no doubt that he experiences a range of things that range from hell to heaven, essentially.
Yeah.
Now why, how, it's difficult to say, but certainly here is a guy that was a complete skeptic and atheist that comes back and says, no, this is all real.
I think a lot of these people are atheists, even like John Burke as well, who we've mentioned a lot, who's a now Christian pastor and has done a lot of research into it. He was an atheist prior to that. I think so was Bruce Grayson. So I think pretty much all the researchers that I've been looking at all started off from an atheist position.
The main researchers. And
And I think everyone that's come back, the two common things is they no longer fear death because they know, in a sense, they believe there's something that happens after life. But they also, the research tells us, they no longer fear life either. So there's a sense of as you say, Matt, what they do with that.
Well, it was interesting. In one account that I read, when this woman went back and she looked at her body and they were telling her that she had to go back. I think the being of light, was telling her, you have to go back. She did experience the being of light as Christ.
Yes.
And, she describes the experience of taking off, like when you've taken off muddy, wet clothes and you've had a really nice warm shower and you're feeling nice and clean. And then if you're told you have to now get back into those dirty, smelly, grubby clothes again that are going to be heavy and weigh you down. She said it felt like, oh no, I have to get back in this. I mean, again, she's saying it's indescribable in one sense, but that's the closest illustration that she could give.
Yeah. And that's such a biblical illustration.
Again, like Paul talks about casting off the tent of the body and, and going to be with the Lord and it being better by far. And I would rather be there. Because, of course, it seems that he actually had a near-death experience. And may I say, there were plenty of moments where he could have. I mean, he was stoned and left for dead.
Yeah.
And by all accounts could well have, died momentarily. So I think Paul may well be referring to his own near-death experience there. And this is a guy that comes back and writes a big part of the New Testament, of course. Yeah.
And then you've got Book of Revelation, which is all the visions.
That's right.
It's not necessarily near-death experience, but you probably don't have to die to experience. If God chooses to show you these things, he'll let you see them.
Yeah, that's right. One of the interesting things, with all of these experiences is that they're not just positive. There are actually experiences of, terrible experiences. I mean, I was debating with myself before, this morning when I was thinking about this, whether I would read one, and I sort of opted not to because it's quite horrible. This is actually common. In fact, Bruce Grayson makes the point. He says I believe on pretty good basis that they're far, far more common than people report because they're just so traumatic that people either repress the experience or won't talk about it. But there are many, many experiences of people who experience essentially hell in different forms, and a lot of the biblical elements, even for people who had no idea about that, are there. Perhaps even elements that we would take to be purely symbolic. And of course, they're describing it again in words and in symbols, but they're saying also that it was much more. It's essentially indescribable, but here's the closest thing. And the closest thing is often things like, a tangible darkness that sort of enveloped them, almost like not just the absence of light, but a sort of a physical, inky kind of darkness. Even the idea of flames and fire, and that comes up a lot, or something mirroring that in some ways. The presence of other, anguish, torment. Also, the sense of absolute deservedness. This sense like I absolutely, in a number of accounts, I know that I absolutely, this is no doubt. It's deservedness. In one account, a complete transparent knowledge of like a complete separation, like isolation, and yet a sense of others in that experience, and also a complete understanding of why other people were there as well in some accounts.
So this ties into with the life review, because most people talk about the life review, not in the sense of God judging them, but them judging themselves when because they become aware of
it's direct awareness. It's not like, oh, hey, you did this wrong. It's like, oh my goodness, I'm now completely aware of every dimension of what was terrible
what I've done
about
to
that.
other people. And now I've got the benefit of being in this other place where I'm able to see things in context and see the big picture and realize the repercussions of my actions, and then feeling the weight, condemning myself at being like that person, where at the time I didn't even think anything of it, but in the life review, I suddenly become aware of, I condemn myself because it's just so bad. The consequences, what I did and took upon myself, and the damage and pain that I caused. And it's almost like
I deserve what's coming.
Yeah. And there's a sense of like recoil from God in a way, saying, I don't deserve this. I condemn myself. I'll take myself off, to hell. Kind of like a way to kind of paraphrase it. They didn't quite put in those words, but that's kind of, you get a sense of that self.
And again, from a biblical context, that makes, we think we're reasonably good people, but compared to God, and compared to how we were created to be, none of us are good.
Well, once we see the big picture, and this is the thing, these are atheists. They never thought there was anything of it, and there weren't big things, but it's the impact that they had on someone. They talk about the interconnectedness of everything and all of us, all of humanity, and so when we do things on each other, the ripple effects of it is really profound, way more profound than they thought. So on this side of eternity, we kind of look at, well, God wouldn't really judge. People are good. God wouldn't judge us and send people to hell. A loving God would not do that. And it almost sounds like you'll almost take yourself there, because the sense of condemnation that you're going to, when all the benefit of all this other knowledge and perspective that you never had, all of a sudden it's revealed to you, you actually will not want to be in the presence of God. It almost sounds like.
And that's one of the things in some accounts that I read, a theme that came up was this sense of this realization of how much of God there actually was in this life. And then when all of that drained away, all of the goodness and the love and it's like that was taken so much for granted. I mean, as I often say, we actually are experiencing the goodness and love and the life of God all the time. But this is described as a state in which that is completely absent. You're almost left purely with your sort of just desserts in a sense, or almost the pure guilt of what, what you've actually done. It's interesting because, I mean, this is an issue that, many theologians are struggling with, and there's a bit of a movement sort of against the idea of any kind of hell, and, that a God of love would not, send people to hell. And so, there are theologians that sort of want to say, well, we're all sort of saved in the end. Now, I don't want to get right into that, but the outright denial of hell, I think this is one of the other things that these experiences actually point to, is that actually this is a reality. I mean, what the Bible says is actually quite, in some cases, they're experiencing quite literally a lot of those elements. So, but one of the other interesting things here is that's, I think, worth talking about, is that in a lot of these, in a number of these cases, these people cry out to God in that situation. And I mean, there's one book called, Second Chance at Heaven is the title of the book. And it's a, girl who, commits suicide, and, she has this terrible, terrible experience, and that she explains very vividly, but she cries out to Jesus, she cries out to God for forgiveness. And actually, God comes and saves her from that. And, of course, when she comes back to light, she's, committed Christian, and it's Jesus, Jesus, Jesus all the way, for the rest of her life. So,
which raises
a question. I mean, it's the same question essentially that relates to people that, that die and they have this pure experience of a God of love and it's all wonderful, right? They might have been a complete atheist and they come back and they say, oh, it's all right. Everyone's accepted. and because there are some among those who say, oh, there's no hell, it's all just love, and we're all, everyone, it's all good for everyone, which, again, this is where first of all, Scripture is important, but that's why you can't just focus on any one, because the cumulative case says, no, actually there is.
Yeah, that's right.
People experience, many people experience judgment, condemnation. So, you have to put these things together. But it does raise the question about the status of what we're describing here, which is a near-death experience. There's also the possibility that, because remember, we're making an assumption about where the point, in a theological sense, because we define, what is death? How do you define death? We could define it, the sort of physiological way to describe it is perhaps, when the parts of the body shut down. I'm not going to try and give a description of that, but it could be when you're brain dead, or when but maybe, there's a point of no return. And indeed, a lot of people experience a kind of boundary, don't they?
Many of them.
Many of them. Yeah.
Look, before we go there, can I just recount again? I think good to just put some of these research stories in, just to give some context around someone who, for instance, their NDE was an experience like you described, Matt. There's a number of them here. I'm just going to read the one that has popped up first for me. After overdosing on cocaine, Paul Ojeda recalls that he saw no light, only a black tunnel into which he was falling deeper and deeper. Believing he was dead and on the way to hell, Ojeda remembers thinking, I'm a good person. I shouldn't be going here. He had long been distant from God, but when he realized the hopelessness of his situation, he says he cried out, please, Lord, I don't want to go to this place. Please save me. He claims to have seen no face or figure after his plea, but had an unmistakable sense of God beside him, asking him, what have you done with the life I've given you? God then replayed his entire life for him, from which he saw he had done nothing meaningful with his 30 years. After waking up in the hospital, or coming back to life in the hospital, being revived, he vowed to find the God that pulled me out of hell. And he now leads a church that serves the Hispanic community in Texas. There's a number of stories like that. I would say, I think you said many, not a lot from the research of that, mostly actually, and again, I think we mentioned in the last podcast, a lot of the darker ones aren't really willing to share their experience. So there are certainly,
and they're probably the ones that where there is no hope. In a sense, it's the ones we hear about are often, sometimes the ones where there is, there's a, the scripture about being saved as one out of the flames.
Yes,
I think it's Paul. Is it Paul that talks about that? Maybe you can try and search that, Stu. So I don't think we should rule out the fact that God can give someone a taste, because I think even in this life we can have a taste of hell. I think the worst kind of experience of guilt and shame actually I think that fundamentally is a kind of experience of hell. I actually, leading actually to my own conversion, like quite dramatically, I believe was like an experience of, I felt like I'd almost, the way I describe it was like I'd swallowed hell, like the condemnation. It was just overwhelming. And then, I never understood the Jesus thing, but I understood then that there was one name that I had to call on. I just knew with all my being, and I said Jesus, and I called on the name of Jesus. And I have described it ever since as almost like a ball of petrol, or just something that just like of inky, hellish something. It just lifted off me, And so, for me, that was like an experience of hell in this life, in the form of guilt and condemnation. And actually, when I read the accounts, it's not so much that it's inside them like it was with me, but they're inside it, in a sense. You know what I mean? So it's a much more pervasive experience, but it's kind of something similar. And so in those cases, it's almost like God is, in a sense, allowing them to have that experience. Now, why, is this, is this second chance theology? Let's not, again, it's really important that we don't construct theologies based on this.
Well, we don't know that you have died. In fact, you probably haven't died in the fullest sense of the because if you
in the fullest theological sense.
Because if you die and you're clinically dead, your brain's kind of flatlined. So your brain switched off. Now you fully see the other dimension that you're in, and you become aware. That doesn't necessarily mean that God, I guess it's God who decides ultimately, are we dead or not? So the fact that we see these things is just a consequence of our brain filter being turned off, and now we're in that space and we can see these things that's going on, and we can have a near-death experience. But as we've mentioned before too, there is that point in no return, which is very, very common. In a lot of these accounts, that there's a point they get warned that if you cross over this,
there's no coming back.
There is no coming back. That to me feels a little bit ominous to me, that doorway. I'm reading into it my own interpretation, but it feels a little ominous, as if the experience that you're having prior to that isn't really the fullness of the revelation.
Yeah.
And you pass through that door, and whatever you felt in terms of that condemnation in your life review, you're actually going to come face to face with God, because you won't be coming back. You know, no man has seen God and lived. It's almost like you pass through the door, you enter in a much fuller revelation and experience of heaven and God. So that, you know, it's kind of like, it feels like we're just in the near-death experiences playing around the edges a bit, and having and being some sense of revelation to us of the predicament that we're in, and that sense of self-condemnation. Can you imagine what it's like to feel so condemned within yourself, because you're looking at it from that almost like God's perspective, that you're condemning yourself, and then being able to call out to Jesus and having all of that condemnation lifted from you. That's almost like the revelation that we never even appreciate in this life, that we take for granted. But in the other side, imagine that sense, the weight of the condemnation, and people are actually calling out to Jesus to save them at that point.
And this is an interesting thing, because I think with great definiteness, I mean, a very common thing, and this is even amongst like complete non-Christians, even people without any Christian background, who encounter Jesus, and with such definiteness.
Yeah.
It's Jesus. It's all about Jesus. You know, I mean, there's a strong sense of He is the Lord of life, and you know, and this sense that, you know, we need to hold on to Jesus. Not everyone experiences that, but there are many who do, and who come back with this sort of definiteness, which you don't really get about any other one. You know, there's no other one sort of figure that keeps coming up, or
no.
You know, even in other sort of religious traditions, or, you know, it's, in fact, you know, the whole being of light and the unconditional love in many ways is quite contrary to maybe the impersonal elements of, say, Brahman in Hinduism, or the very kind of,
or Allah,
the kind of angry, just sort of God. I mean, this is another interesting thing in Islam, to finish my sense, that so there is. This is where it keeps coming back to what the Bible does say about God. One of the interesting things, though, is, and this is where we've got to be careful, that we're not shaping our beliefs based on any one of these accounts.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, again, I'm going to keep repeating this. All of these accounts, the cumulative case points to the New Testament.
Yeah, totally.
That this is real stuff, right? It's remarkable.
And it's consistent.
How consistently it points to what the New Testament describes, right?
Yep.
So that's, you know, you go to Scripture for, you know, in order to form our beliefs. Because one of the things that I found is that through the interpretive grid, you know, some people come back and say, oh, yeah, I encountered God, and I encountered Jesus, and I encountered this and that. Oh, and it's not what the Bible describes, because, you know, God was like, and then they'll say something like, oh, because God was a God of love. And it's like, that's what the Bible describes. So it's often, you know, or like, oh, it's like, Jesus is like a separate, like a person. And it's like, what did you think?
That's what I found too. I was watching an interview with John Burke and Abden Alexander.
Yeah.
Obviously, two sides of the how they interpret everything. But John Burke from a Christian perspective, Abden Alexander from a more in the New Age.
Yeah.
Who had an NDE and ended up more of a New Age kind of idea. And it was interesting to see those two talking about. And he was saying exactly the same thing. He goes, I don't agree with the Christian view because the God I saw was one of love. And John Burke was going, that's exactly the Christian God.
And I would say it's exclusive. That idea is very unique to the Christian, to the biblical revelation of who God is as a personal being who is characterized by love. Yeah. And that love is only really given substance in the person of Christ, who is the ultimate expression of that love, saving us from our sins. The pervasiveness of that love and the grace, particularly, that is the natural, is the extension of that love.
And the contradiction,
again, completely unique to the Christian faith.
The contradiction in their own worldview. So you're either an atheist, or the other bit of research I did was trying to look at it through the Islamic lens. If I've looked at it through the atheist lens, the Christian lens, what does it look like from the Muslim side? Do they see this all interpreting into an Islamic framework? And all I really found was the Islamic apologists trying to explain why there was the God of love and Jesus, or
more like the Christian God,
the absence of any kind of reference to Muhammad, and any time a Muslim comes back and says, I saw Allah, it was in reference to this God of love anyway. So so they were trying to provide some sort of framework to understand why NDEs are all just sort of made up or not necessary for Muslims, because they've got the fullness of the truth and they don't need these NDEs or something. I can't remember, but they had a way of kind of describing the absence of it. So it's often completely contradictory to what they expected of God.
Yeah. And just, again, some context around the research on this. NDE testimony with large percentage, certainly at least 50% of the people that have been researched on NDEs, regardless of whether they believed in Jesus before their experience, report meeting Jesus as their ambassador in the supernatural realm. That's largely in the Western world. On the non-Western NDEs that were researched, they still recognize the existence of a supernatural being of love. They just don't call him Jesus, but the experience is essentially the same. They just don't recognize him as Jesus.
Yeah.
So is it worth then going into, because I think there's some really good implications that comes out of this, how we do reconcile the fact that people are having these experiences, but they're coming back adamant that there is no judgment. Like, any judgment is just self-judgment from the life review. But other than that, there's a God of acceptance and love, and all the religions are all putting all of this stuff on people. And the reality is that everything's going to be okay for everyone. We can pretty much reject all religions. Everything's going to be okay. No need to fear death. And so that I think is probably the biggest criticism that I'm seeing in terms of NDEs from a Christian perspective, this implication of universalism.
Yeah, that's right. But if you take the cumulative case, then that's in contradiction with a whole lot of other people that are experiencing judgment.
I would say to that, though, at one level I'd say, but why would God allow someone to have an NDE, an atheist to have an NDE, and the takeaway from that is almost like an even further hardening of their heart against the truth of the gospel. Now they're even though now they've changed their mind, they know there's a spiritual dimension and a God, but now they've seen it and experienced, and now they believe there's nothing to fear. So all fear of, that's one of the things that was common across all of them, is removal of fear of death.
Well, you have those ones, you have those particular ones.
That's because they think everything's going to be okay. So now that's how they end up. So God allows them to see that, and then that's the result of it. And some of them do end up coming to Jesus, but many of them then just end up in like New Age,
which is just an exaggerated version of what is actually already the case.
Exactly,
because they're already experiencing the goodness and the love of God now, like we all are, right? Yep. And so then they have this experience, and they experience that way, way more vividly and multidimensionally. So again, it's what we do with that. Remember, Paul begins, although they knew God, they neither worshipped him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their foolish hearts were darkened. So, there's still our response to that. And so there's almost an there's even more accountability perhaps than in that case.
Yeah, I understand the frustration because, we're trying to preach the gospel and convince people that, you need to get right with God. There's a problem here. And then when people, like an atheist has an NDE and they go to heaven, they don't get the gospel necessarily. They come back almost anti the gospel because everything's going to be okay. It's the opposite of what we're trying to say there. And this is the conflict with what we're taught in the New Testament. And this is the thing that a lot of Christians would raise objections with NDEs, that people are coming back with no presentation of anything that even really looks like the gospel in that sense. And so I struggle. I find myself going, if I was God, I would have.
Gee, I'm glad you're not. Just to put that in there for everyone.
I would have.
That's a dangerous start to a sentence, that is.
You see where I'm going, though? Like, if I was God, I would have given them a clear presentation of the gospel. But there again, if I was God in this life, everybody says, why doesn't God make himself known? Like, why doesn't he just appear in the sky?
Yeah.
Why? It's all, why doesn't God do what I think God should do? And so, and even when Jesus walked the earth, he didn't sort of manifest himself as
not as people wanted
God.
That's right. Yeah.
So he lived with the contradiction, not really saying as clearly as what we wanted him to say, I am God. He lived with it and let people kind of come to that realization on their own. So it's not like he appeared as a being of light, in the middle of Jerusalem, for example, to prove who he was. He allowed the ambiguity to exist there. And what the biggest conclusion that I can come with it is that it comes back to where God says, seek and you'll find, as if there's something really profound in this idea of seeking. And that doesn't change whether you've had an NDE or not, because seeking seems to be the way that God wants us to find him. So he actually withholds that revelation of who he is and the things from us. So he actually wants us, he gives us stuff to push us along the way, but there's something about it where he actually wants us to actively seek him out. And what I'm kind of looking at, people have these NDEs come back, the tiny little glimpse into heaven, and then they come back and then they go, I know it all now. I'm going to arrogantly create my own religious framework, and I'm just going to go and invent all the stuff based on what I've seen and what I know, and that's it. And yet they've encountered a being of light and love that, really profoundly lines up with the God, revealed to us in the Bible, and yet they won't seek. They'd rather rely on their own interpretation and own understanding of that, yet others have other experiences like being condemned, facing the condemnation and ending up in the grip of hellish experiences. So why would I trust my interpretation of that? And it's almost like God leaves that question to you. Many people will have seen that experience of God and come back and not bother to seek God, and then still rely on their own understanding and ignore the fact that I think I look at myself and I think if I had that and if I was an atheist and I'd had that experience, I'd want to go and find out, well, what did I just see? What did the religions of the world teach about this?
And what's the right way to respond? Because I think particularly in our culture, we have this idea that like knowing, if I get some enlightened and now I know everything and it's all okay. But actually the important thing is how we respond to that. And people who come back from those experiences who take that line, oh, it's all fine now and we don't need to sort of worry about anything. And I mean, the response is completely inadequate. And certainly they don't become perfect human beings. They will they may improve in some respects and be more mindful of how they treat others, but certainly not perfect. And it's interesting, in so many accounts, they talk about the disappointment of how they're still selfish and they're still, but they're much more mindful. They're conscious though of them being selfish. I'm thinking, but how are you responding to that? And
I think that's a really good, the response is a really good point, because there's a guy called James Bilby who's a philosophical theologian in the US who, again, we don't know the answer to this. Well, I don't know the answer. You guys are way brainier than me. You might know the answer to this, but I don't know the answer to this. He suggests the point is that he suggests that for people, for instance, who are having a post-mortem chance of redemption, in other words, during their NDE, have never actually had to make, or have never been propositioned with the choice they had to make.
Yeah.
So in other words, they've never really heard a clear gospel message. The first time they kind of sense this is in that situation.
Or whereas, it wasn't they weren't able to truly respond, or it was through a certain filter or whatever.
And so the point is, as you were just saying, it's about our response to that that ultimately makes our choice. The fact that Jesus has done what he did for all of us, for all of mankind, is one thing. That doesn't save all of mankind. We've then got to choose to appropriate that. And his suggestion is that perhaps looking at these NDE experiences where people have had this, there are people who have never potentially had the opportunity to respond one way or the other. Anyway, just to
or a genuine. I mean, and again, remember, we're making assumptions about where the line of death. I mean, theologically, common theological definition of death is is the separation of body and soul, essentially. Like, where is the final sort of cutoff, the irrevocable separation? Because, there's still some connection with the body until it's completely cut off. And this is the experience of that border. So there are things that happen in that experience. And it's also an experience of timelessness, right? So sometimes, this is only a few minutes of essentially physical death, and yet they are experiencing eons potentially. I mean, the girl who described her experience of hell, like, she felt she was there for an eternity. Like, it was because it was completely timeless. Duration didn't seem to even apply. So there's this borderish sort of experience. But we've got to be careful that we don't infer theology from these experiences, but also we shouldn't use theology to limit the possibilities of what God might do, because again, we're operating in our theological language in, our three dimensions and space time and within our understanding. I don't think we should ever use that to limit what God can do. And I'm certainly open to the fact, if I ask you the question, do you think that we will discover God to be more gracious or less gracious than we thought?
Yeah.
And I would probably expect that I think we will see that God was far, far more gracious than we ever imagined.
Yeah.
In the end. Now, that I'm not saying that everyone is, I'm not advocating universalism, which is the idea that, no one gets condemned. Everyone just, everyone goes to heaven in the end. But nevertheless, I think there's something within us perhaps that wants to,
and I think
believe that everyone, everyone should, all of these people should go to hell. I think, remember, it's God's desire to save people. And I think we'll discover in the end that, wow, okay, God was far more gracious than I even expected.
And it's never about doctrine or having the correct set of facts.
Yeah,
is one of the things that I've kind of taken away from it. It doesn't mean to say our doctrine, we can push it aside or whatever. It's not important. It is. That's our guidebook on this side. But on the other side, it's almost like there's not like a collection of facts, that doctrinal statements that it's like it just becomes self-evident that there is a God. He loves us, and listening to a lot of these people who had these experiences, and they're saying, oh, no, it can't be the Christian God because the God I experienced was a loving, forgiving God. And it's like, well, what are people thinking that we're saying as Christians. Yes. That's what they're taking away from it. It's kind of like going, well, the whole point of it is that is the message.
Yeah. And I think, and I'm not in any way criticizing the bride of Christ here, but I feel sometimes as Christians, we talk way too much about what we're opposed to or what we're against, and not enough about what we're for. I think the world hears a lot from the church about what's bad and what we shouldn't be doing, not enough about the goodness of God and the amazing living in a Christian faith. Coming back to your point, Matt, I think, there's lots of scriptural reference, unto which much is given, much is required. I think the more we know, the more that's been revealed to us, the more accountable we're going to be ultimately.
Yeah.
And so for those who haven't had much revealed to them, I agree with you. I think God is going to be more gracious, not less gracious.
Or it's been misrepresented, because there's lots, in this life, there's so much misrepresentation. And at the end, we have to trust in God's justice here, and in God's grace
and in God's word.
That's right. That's and he will do what is right in the end. We're not the judge; He is. But it also brought me back again and again and again to the fact that in this life, we are given the scriptures to guide us, right? So certainly you wouldn't want to read these accounts and think, I'll wait till then. I'll wait till I die, and God will give me, and then I'll see and I'll make a decision then. I mean, it's interesting because in one account, actually Bruce Grayson shares that the guy actually is sort of plummeting essentially into hell, found that his will was locked against God, that he could not cry out because his will was sort of locked into that trajectory. It was like, okay, now we don't know why people are having these only God knows why. Remember, we can't. It's not for us to judge and form ideas and doctrines, because we're not the all-knowing. We have these little glimpses from these near-death experiences, the cumulative effect of which should point us back to Scripture, right? I mean, that was a very strong takeaway from me. It's like, okay, let's take Jesus way more seriously, right?
Yeah. And can I just say to that, and we just said this just before we started recording, is so many of these NDEs affirm so much of what's in the New Testament. Why are you going to go, it's right there, but it's wrong about this?
Yeah.
As believers of the Word and of God at His Word, we might not understand it fully, and we may see through somewhat blurry lenses for now, but there's so much evidence from these NDEs that is supporting what we read consistently through the New Testament, that we need to not just dismiss the one bit that maybe we think isn't quite right.
Yeah, because we don't have the full revelation. Correct. But where I've said like scriptures are like a guide, it's that sort of downplays the significance a bit, because it's more than that. I think that's how we enter into making the choice that God wants us to make. And it's putting the framework around that to guide us to a point where we can make that decision and receive the what God has done for us and understand sin, not in the fullness of everything, but it kind of gives us enough that we are confronted with the opportunity to make that choice. I mean, I think in terms of God's grace as well, I think, God will do everything He can to save every person that He can. I think
God so loved the world.
The lengths that He is going to save people, we don't realize it. But many will come face to face with this loving God and then walk away in their own arrogance, which is what I see happening with many of these people who move into more the New Age direction after the NDEs. If I had this experience of this unimaginably loving God, my response now would be, I want to know that God now. I don't care about all the other stuff. I want to know this God now. I want to be in relationship with this God. Surely that's your response. And if that's not your response, that you're making a choice. You are making a choice there that may be resolved at some point, but it's all about trying to give you enough in there so you seek and make some sort of choice. That's what He wants you to do, because He wants to grab hold of you and rescue you from the fate of that awaits you.
And also to face the incongruity between, experience this God of love, and then there's this incongruity between the state of my life and and what has been experienced. And so there's also a choice to make around that. And I think it points to our need for salvation and reconciliation with God. So, we come back to the choices that we make, because in the end, God has given us this incredible responsibility. I mean, this is part of being in the image of God, is the ability to make a choice of this gravity. He created us for relationship with him. And so at the end of the day, we have to make a choice as to, will we worship and serve God? Will we receive his hand of reconciliation given to us through Christ? Will we or not? And then in the end, there's still that choice that we come back to.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivetoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.